Hey everybody, it's Matt Powers. I'm a seed saver, gardener, permaculturist, author, teacher, family guy. And I teach people all over the world how to live regeneratively. And a lot of that is, kind of like debunking, myth busting. And one of those things that I learned along the way, dynamic accumulators. It's a term that was popularized by Robert Keurig, who to this day is trying to stamp it out. So what happened was he read it somewhere, and he then put it in his book as this concept. And then because it was wrong, he ended up going back and studying roots extensively and writing Understanding Roots, Demystifying Roots, all these amazing books about roots because of how originally this concept was wrong. I'll get into why it's wrong in a second. But first, let's start off with the most notorious of permaculture plants, one that causes contention of all sorts. It's our friend, excuse me, Calpy, I love you too, but here we go, right here. Here we go. This is Comfrey. Do you guys know Comfrey? How about you come a little closer? So this is Comfrey. This is from roots, a root cutting that my sons and I got out in the wilderness. That we found it just growing feral. It was obviously just maybe that was a farm area or something at one point. But there's amazing qualities to this plant that are independent of. Let me just come over here. So there's qualities of these plants that are independent of this whole dynamic accumulator concept and myth. So yeah, Comfrey's behind me. That's what I'm talking about. So the thing is, you don't want to just say Comfrey's bad, right? Comfrey has amazing aspects to it, but is it a dynamic accumulator? So a dynamic accumulator is this concept that it goes really deep. It's tunneling down with its roots and going extra deep to pull up these nutrients that no one seems to get but these special plants from deep in the soil. But is that really accurate? Well, if we look at my book here, where I talk about this, the top 2 inches, 5 centimeters of soil is the most fertile. And this means that those roots are going to actually be going horizontal much more for the nutrients than they're going down. In fact, they're really going down for water and the nutrients. And there's instances where there's pockets of nutrients and whatnot. But we're talking about like how they behave. And really they're moving. And the reason Comfrey spreads so easily is because it's moving horizontally. It's moving. It's not moving deeper into the soil like people talk about. And it's funny, when I first talked to Robert about this, he was like, fine, Matt, show me the 6-foot roots. Show me your 6-foot roots, Matt. Get me a map of your roots and we'll talk about it then. And I started like playing around with my roots and I was like, huh. Then I read his book, and when we talk about, they're going super deep with their roots, they're getting all this stuff, it's really important to understand that it really depends on your soil. Because the testing that Robert Keurig was sourcing found that it was really great at accumulating lead. And you don't want lead. You don't want to feel violent. You don't want to have all these weird, criminal tendencies. Because that is what lead will lead to. That the unleaded gases was directly correlated to the drop in crime as we started phasing out lead. So yeah, it's super crazy. You're like, oh, I don't want lead. No one wants lead in their head. But the reality is, every plant is what I call a nutrient accumulator. And so, and that may seem silly, right? But the reality is this. All right, so daikon radish, Masanobu Fukuoka, why was he using it so much? Well, it's a phosphorus accumulator, and it goes really deep into the soil, and it accumulates a lot of protein, which is made of amino acids, which are made of nitrogen. So you end up with a situation where, they may not have nodules on them, but they're incredible at bringing in phosphorus and bringing in nitrogen. And then even better at that is buckwheat. And I'm referencing my book here, the Permaculture Student too. But turnips are brassicas, and all brassicas to a certain degree are going to be bringing in phosphorus and some nitrogen. And actually, every plant is bringing in their unique consortia of nutrients and minerals and all this stuff, and they're all doing it. So even though, those are the nitrogen fixers, you have plants that have protein in them, and that means they have nitrogen in them. So, I mean, like buckwheat. Let's take buckwheat, for instance. It's a nitrogen fixer, and it's like a phosphorus accumulator like daikon radish. But then, on top of it, it'll steal from, these guys right here, from these cowpeas, and the cowpeas will just be like, I gotta make more, and they'll go nuts. And so they'll actually ramp up their work fixing nitrogen out of the air in the soil, the spaces in the soil, the interstitial spaces. So the reality is that everyone's got their hand on the wheel. Everyone's working to accumulate a unique grouping of minerals and nutrients that are beneficial. And this is why we need to really ramp up. We need to ramp up the biology, the diversity, so that we get a really broad diversity of nutrients and minerals happening and cycling in our systems. So I hope that put things into perspective. And some plants are just unbelievable. I mean, I think it's the term dynamic that gets everyone really excited. It's like, well, it seems like a really intrepid plant. It's so dynamic. You know what I mean? It's like, what is that? It's the hero plant. You know what I mean? But the reality is that every plant is really amazing, and probably like buckwheat, alfalfa, plants that kind of don't get the front, the front page, of attention. They're probably the ones that deserve, any sort of dynamic accumulator status, if that even existed, and it doesn't. So the reality is everything's a nutrient accumulator, and you really want to find nutrient accumulators that serve well as mulch. So your mulch plants, you're going to actually map up, where you're going to map out your needs. So you're going to have your nitrogen mulch plants that are, and they can have a whole diversity of different things that they accumulate. But you're going to think, your N, P, K, and then you're going to think your really good diverse harvesters of a lot like alfalfa and other things like that are going to really take in a lot of minerals, complex minerals, to produce what they're trying to produce. So if you take that kind of in mind and you look at the most nutritious foods, you suddenly realize that the most nutritious foods are they're creating all this package of these minerals and nutrients. But at the same time, if we remove them from that site, we remove that special work they just did for the soil. So it becomes this game where we really need to find a balance between returning to nature and taking. It's that reciprocity again, right? So as we think about these things, we really want to rely heavily upon mulch, heavily upon the cycle of nature in our whatever our zone and bioregion is. So if it's fall, like here in the Pacific Northwest, as soon as those rains start, I'm going to be chopping and dropping while it's still wet and warm during that transition before winter, so I get that decomposition happening, and then I can replant in that decomposition. And then when winter does set in, I get that snow-covered decomposition. It all depends on where you are and what you're doing, but that's just the world where I am at right now currently. So I hope that you're having an amazing time wherever you're at, and I hope that that debunking didn't didn't bum you out at all. I hope that gave you hope and excitement, because the reality is there's so much more to the story. There are interesting actors, niche players, all this stuff out there waiting for us in the plant world. And we just got to open our minds to the diversity of nutrient accumulators that do exist. I'm Matt Powers. Grow abundantly, learn daily, and live regeneratively. and I will see you soon.